podcast, where we discuss the challenges and triumphs of single life from a Christian perspective. In this episode, we delve into a sensitive topic that has been a source of controversy within the church, the purity culture and its impact on single Christians. We recognize that this is a sensitive subject matter as it involves discussions around sex and relationships. We want to acknowledge that some listeners may find this topic uncomfortable or triggering. We encourage you to take care of yourself while listening and to pause or skip this episode if necessary. That being said, we believe it's important to have an honest and open dialogue about the impact of purity culture on Christian singles. We discuss how the pendulum has swung from the sexual revolution to the purity movement and how this has affected our views on relationships and sexuality. We also talk about the dangers of the prosperity gospel and how it can be harmful to our faith. As we navigate this discussion, we aim to provide encouragement and hope for those who may have been negatively impacted by purity culture. We hope that this episode will provide a safe space for reflection and growth. Welcome to the Route 77 podcast. My name is Natasha. I am your host today. I am here with Monique.
Hello.
But no David. He wasn't able to join us for this podcast. Today we will be talking about the prosperity gospel and purity culture. This is something that affects many people, has affected many people, particularly from the 90s and the 2000s where I grew up, but it still has an effect on people, both singles today, youth, and those who have lived through it. I'd like to just start by reading the title of an article that was from 2019. Feminist pastor unveils sculpture made of old purity rings. And the sculpture was made into female genital part. And we'd like to look at that, and the first reaction is, ooh, like feminist pastor. Women pastor, feminist, must be crazy. And why would they make it into something so lewd? And who would do this? And I guess that is questions to ask. But I'd like to ask, why did they get so many purity rings that they were able to make this sculpture? And it was actually a decent-sized sculpture. It wasn't tiny.
Reminded you of the golden calf from
Yes,
Exodus.
It reminded me of the golden calf. What? I just put it in. This is what came out. So yeah, it was a really eye-opening article. You can Google it. It's just in a lot of things. But
beware of the pictures.
Yes. But the thing is about it is just the reason they were able to do this and the reason why they did it is because so many, particularly women, were disenfranchised by the church during the 90s and the 2000s when this purity culture came to its height.
Yeah. It was on the tail end of the 1980s with the sexual revolution from the 60s and 70s and the 80s. And then HIV and AIDS came around. It was basically the church went, okay, we've got to do something because this is happening. What can we do? And isn't that around the time when McDowell's book came out? Was it within the 1990s? Yeah. And his book was titled I Kissed Dating Goodbye or something.
No, it's not Josh.
Oh,
Josh Harris.
Josh Harris. Okay. Divorced his wife.
That was Josh Harris.
Was that Josh Harris? So that's who I was thinking of.
Why wait?
Yeah. That was the book that Josh McDowell put out as a parent of a pre-teenager. So it equips you to discuss the emotional, psychological, physical, and spiritual reasons for saying no to premarital sex.
Yeah. Josh McDowell, Why Wait? From 1987. Yeah.
But they discovered that it was a way of doing youth ministry by doing this purity pledge. It was a purity pledge that either you wrote a pledge or you had a ring. And it was basically what you were saying is that you would stay pure until marriage. In a very small nutshell.
Yes.
Because there's a whole heck of a lot more to the purity culture than that. There was a lot of fear and shame that was involved in that.
Yeah. Let's start back with the prosperity gospel. Because that idea came out more in the 50s, was when it became the most well-known with televangelists. And we had Oral Roberts. And later, we have ones like Benny Hinn and anything like that. We see it as a name it and claim it or a health and wealth gospel, where they teach that we are the king's kids. We are said in the Bible, we're the king's kids. So the king would give us all the good things. They would give us health and wealth, prosperity. So the prosperity gospel has this idea that you can judge God's favor based on your health and your wealth. So if you see someone who has a lot of money and is very healthy, then they have the most of God's favor. And if you don't, then they have the least of God's favor. You should be able to gain these things simply by having enough faith and or giving enough money usually to the ministry that's asking for the money. So they have this idea that if only we believe enough, if only we give enough, and God owes us something. And this has numerous issues here when it comes to the general problem. Theology of churches that do not hold to this whatsoever. So a lot of mainline churches will reject this outright. And we agree. You cannot biblically back this up. Although they do take verses out of context, it is not a biblical theology that you can back up. So it's rejected outright. And yet parts of it still has tendrils that moves within the evangelical churches today. And we don't see it because it's not so overt. And it's not the name it and claim it as in the money and the health. And this idea, we're talking about it in specifically when it relates to the purity culture or singleness, especially it came out the most in the 90s and the 2000s, but it's still there today. This idea that if we act a certain way and if we just think the right things, then God owes us a spouse. So that's how the prosperity gospel has eked its way into evangelical thinking. And although it's not explicitly taught this way, you don't go to church and they say, if you do this, then God will do this. It's more like implicit.
It's hinted.
It's the stuff that you're told to do things like abstain from sex and to make your purity pledges, stay away from boys, stay away from girls,
Wear the right clothes,
all these things. And that will mean that God will give you a spouse, and not only a spouse of your dreams, and not only that, but the sex life of your dreams.
Do they even know what that is?
Yeah, I understand where the ideas came from. Like Monique had mentioned, we're in a culture that was trying to combat recreational dating. So dating had gone from trying to find a life partner, a spouse, to just
bed hopping.
Yeah, bed hopping. You did what you wanted to do, whoever you wanted to do it. It was fun. It was nothing, no commitment whatsoever.
Yep.
So tends to happen, unfortunately, sometimes in churches, is that we go from one pendulum swing to the other. And we went from this, we cannot have this, so we're going to create a whole new culture, and we're going to call it purity culture, and we're going to develop it so that we won't fall into that. And courtship became the thing to do. It's a whole other story for me. I've lived through that. And to me, there's no one way that you will get a spouse. That's the right way, like the quote unquote right way.
Oh, come on. There's got to be a right way to get a spouse.
So it's not A plus B equals C. This is not how it works. You can go through an entire courtship. You can ask the father's permission. You can never kiss.
Can you hold hands?
It depends. Okay. Maybe hold hands, maybe not. There's no touching, physical touching whatsoever.
And then the marriage night.
And then the marriage night happens. But then even the marriage itself doesn't end up all that it was promised to be. But then again, it could, depending on how you're like building it up. But at the moment, we're just talking about like, we assume that if you do it this way and this way, this is the best way, and you're guaranteed. They don't come out and say you're guaranteed, but that's the feeling that's put into it, is that you're guaranteed awesome sex, an amazing partner, no problems from like in your marriage, and kids will come, no problem. The kids won't be a problem. Like you're going to have this health and wealth gospel life. You're going to have, I named it, I claimed it, and that's what's going to happen. And unfortunately, that's not what happened, especially for ones who are like me or in their 40s. If you're in the Christian culture of that time, you lived through this most likely. And we did in our church. I was a little more aside from it because I was homeschooled. Almost everybody in our church, we're a very tiny church, was homeschooled. So we didn't have so much worry about how you were dressing and measuring the lengths of skirts and things like that. Plus I was a tomboy, so I was never really worried. Like it wasn't even in my brain to think about those things. So I feel like I'm slightly off center from the main impact, and yet I was still extremely impacted in a very negative way. And it was the intent was good. And this is something we may talk about a lot, but I had mentioned it to my housemate, Monique. There's an Adventures in Odyssey podcast in our podcast, Adventures in Odyssey episode called Rights, Wrongs, and Reasons. And this was probably out in the 90s or 2000. And basically, the premise of the episode was that you could take a scenario and you could look at it and see that you could do something you could do the right thing for the right reason, the right thing for the wrong reason, the wrong thing for the right reason, or the wrong thing for the wrong reason. And unless it's the right thing for the right reason, all the other three were not good. There was sin in there.
It was sin.
And so I feel like the courtship and the purity culture that was pushed at the time was the wrong thing done for the right reason. They wanted a positive result out of it. They were trying to protect young people. They were trying to create like an alternative to the culture of the day. Again, it was the wrong thing, which I mean wrong as in exclusively seeing this as the way to go. But for the right reason, their hearts, I think, were in the right place.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have come back on Joshua Harris, who has his marriage fell apart. He's divorced and he has left the faith. So that's, as of this recording, it's happened a few years ago. But like, he wanted to share something positive that he had lived. And so he wrote this book, which became part of this culture. And how many people blame him. Yeah. They sent him like letters,
he became a poster child.
Yeah, did all these negative things, how he ruined their lives and whatnot. But that's not fair to Joshua Harris because he took something he was living, he believed that had worked for him and wanted to share that with other people. And then people took that and created it as the blueprint to follow.
Yeah.
And unfortunately,
it's that thing. What works for one person may not work for another person.
Yeah.
So you can't just take, this is it, and you're all going to follow it whether you like it or not.
Exactly.
Poor God.
You feel for him? Yeah. I don't think it's fair to put any blame on any specific person because I think this was done with good intentions, but it was just, yes, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. But like I said, the wrong thing of promoting this as the answer, the way to a happy, healthy, wealthy life, even though the wealth may not be in money, it might be in relationship wealth. It was just the wrong thing to do, but for the right reasons. I will definitely understand the heart of the people who created this and wanted to share it. And I will not ding them for that. No. One thing that I have learned in counseling for myself, they really pressed into us was that you made the best decision with the information you had at the time. So it helped us not to feel guilt and shame over things that happened in the past. You might have learned something 5 minutes later that would have changed that decision. But at that moment, you believed, even if you had created wrong intentions from other people, you still believed you were doing the right thing. Not many people do the wrong thing because it's wrong. They go, oh, this is going to be so evil and that's Satan's job. He is going to poke and prod and create wrong things for the sake of it being wrong. Yeah. Most people believe they're doing right. Yeah.
So shaming Josh for the book by other Christian people because of believing that he himself
had the answer,
ruined their life. That was wrong.
Yeah.
That was very wrong
because he's not the Bible.
No, he's not.
Just a fallible. He's a fallible person, right. And he probably wished he could have done a revised version, but it was too late by then.
Yeah. Didn't he recalled his book out of publication?
I'm not sure. Yeah. But I know he probably wished he never wrote it because it just became such a negative in his life. But how much did that have in-impact on his marriage?
And on him leaving the faith.
Him leaving the faith.
Yeah.
So I think it's very important that because I've lived through it, I am definitely a product of a purity culture, that I understand that people loved me. And sometimes things got hurtful because they loved me. Again, they didn't believe it was hurtful at the time, but it was something later. That's what had happened. So I just want to put that on record at the beginning, just saying we're not bashing the people who were involved in this or who created even this idea of the purity culture.
We just want to bring an awareness of it.
Yeah. And understand where it veers off of God's plan and desire because we
I
are
don't finish your sentence.
not at all. You don't finish my sandwiches at all.
Sorry.
Just let it go.
Just let it go. All right. So that's pretty much an introduction of what we're going to be talking about. So one of the things that drives the purity culture is the fear motivation. So some of that fear motivation is from if you have sex before marriage, you could technically contract some sort of sexual disease. HIV, AIDS, some sort of an STD, you could become pregnant. These are real fears, but that doesn't necessarily mean that will happen. But that's their motivation, right?
Yeah. If you put like the fear of God in them, so to speak,
Yeah.
if you do this, you might die or you might have some sort of negative impact. And yes, there are consequences to sinful behavior.
Yes. But there's consequences to every
single
single sinful behavior. Yeah.
And the ultimate one is death.
Yes, we
And
know that.
So it is like it is if you're not saved, then the ultimate consequence is death. So how you act doesn't change that.
No.
So to use fear by telling these young people that
Sex is the worst thing possible.
yeah, if you have sex, it's like all has
You're
been
wrong.
lost. You've lost your pure wedding sex honeymoon.
Yeah.
Then it created a culture where people, if they did sin in a sexual way, then they thought they were damaged good, where they could never attain that health and wealth, that prosperity, marriage that they were told.
Some of the metaphors that they use to inflict some of this fear and grossness, really. I heard this on another podcast where they took a cup and they told all the teenagers to spit in it. And the boys are like, yeah, gross. That alone makes me want to barf.
Yeah.
And then they said, if you had sex before marriage, it's like you're telling your spouse to drink that. Ew.
Yeah. It's very graphic.
That's very disgusting.
I remember the tape one.
Oh, the tape one.
Where if you put some tape on your arm and then you pull it off, then you put it back on. And the next time you pull it off, it won't be as sticky. That's like the relationships that you build through sex, especially, is that like you won't be able to connect like with future partners as well, as much as you connected with the first one, even if it was like, or the one that you had the most capability of connecting with, because you've created like a tear or damage that becomes more of like a scar tissue that is never quite the same again. And it's so that's like the idea that I remember hearing.
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah.
As a girl who didn't grow up in the church and I was not a virgin. I'm just going to put that out there because I didn't grow up in the church and I was a product of the 80s. So that purity culture thing is just like, what? Maybe that's why that pastor said I was Jezebel. And as a woman who's had a baby, once you have birth children, your physiological body changes with that. So that tape thing, that makes no sense. But there was that one, and I had people use this more in regards to divorce, but also for sex, where you had a blue piece of paper and you had a pink piece of paper and they glued them together. And that's what happened. That's how you become one. That's how they described becoming one. You were like two pieces of paper glued together. And then if you break up or separate, you're going to take those two pieces of paper apart and there's always going to be parts of the paper stuck to each thing. I've heard that analogy, and I think that's one of the other ones that they have used as well.
Yeah, no, definitely. And there's many of these that were used on the young people of that time. And I think sometimes still get used, although there's probably some sort of updated version about internet and iPods that we don't know about. But it also created this unrealistic expectation of marriage that if you did all these things, like I mentioned before, the boys would have a porn star in the bedroom, the girls would have their Mr. Darcy. I said it out loud.
I'm just like, a porn star in the bedroom. Okay, then.
Yeah, that's what I've basically promised.
Guys,
if you just hold the sex in, if you hold the sex in and not have this counterfeit sex that you're going to get a porn star in the bedroom, have a hot wife that always wants to sleep with you. And women, you're going to get a Mr. Darcy. I think that applies. I don't actually like those movies. That's what I've heard. You're going to get the Mr. Darcy or the Thor or Captain America physique that will give you all the romance that you could possibly want. That's why I'm being extreme. But yeah, that's the type of, if only you wait, like all these fantasies that you've created in your head will come true.
Yes, you will get that fairy tale that, we all grew up with, the Disney fairy tale, the princess and the prince, and someday my prince will come.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Oh, please.
And so, like, one actually said basically, what was it? They said they used sex to sell celibacy.
Yes.
When we're doing the preparation for this podcast, one podcaster said they were using sex
To sell.
to sell celibacy or to sell abstinence. And when I look back, I'm like, that is so true. They're basically just saying, don't have sex now, but you can have sex later. And you're creating this whole idea like a reward system.
They cheapen grace.
Yeah. And it's, if you do A and B, then you will get C.
Yeah.
And that,
it's based on my pleasure, my satisfaction. It's self-centered instead of other-centeredness. So you're only thinking about yourself. Is what can I get out of this? And if you do this, then so they really make you focus on your own self, in your own wants, your own
your passions.
and your own passions. But in any loving relationship, in a covenantal marriage, it's not all about me.
And it also like really cheapens singleness.
Yes.
Because basically your single time is spent trying to save yourself for the marriage. So you're trying to not do a bunch of stuff so that you can get married and have whatever it is that you want from marriage. And so
you live in a fantasy
you're,
life.
you're living a fantasy life. You're just preparing for something that may or may not happen in the marriage part and will not happen in the fantasy part. And so the singleness time is not actually a time to be celebrated, a time to develop Christian character. It's none of these things. It's just about curbing your lust.
Yep. And they also force on you the responsibility that you are responsible for other people's thoughts and actions.
Yeah.
So that's where the short skirts thing comes in. How long are your skirts? What are you wearing? Are you dressing? Do not cause your brother to stumble. So a lot of responsibility is laid
particularly on the women. Yeah. Because a guy could go around without a shirt and they weren't told that they were tempting the women. Although there are probably a lot of scrawny teenagers, but I don't know. But
scrawny. Sorry, guys.
But it was like, so there was a lot of unfair pressure put on women to basically deny their own sexuality in a sense.
Yeah.
So the girl's job was keep their sexual purity and keep the guy's sexual purity.
Oh, that's a lot
of responsibility to lay on anybody. And that's not biblical either. Okay, yes, you are supposed to act in a way that doesn't cause your brother to stumble. And I think there is something to be said about modest dressing and things like that. Why are you dressing in a certain way? Are you trying to provoke the lust of the boys or the men? Right. That is definitely a wrong reason. See, wrong thing, wrong reason.
What does Justin say about all of that? You take a good thing, turn it into a God thing, and it becomes a bad thing.
Yeah. We're really plugging our pastor every single podcast, so we really hope he listens, and then maybe we'll get a mention.
So then it's pretty much making purity your God.
Yes.
Is really what they're trying to do.
Your whole focus of your single life is your purity.
And your status, how you did or didn't handle this. So, the sin of idolatry.
Yeah, exactly. And you're also putting less responsibility on the boys. You're basically telling them, one podcaster was saying he was told to put all the sexual frustration or out on the football field, out on the sport field. And I could get that idea. Like they have that like kind of energy, just go run it off somewhere.
And you did that with soccer?
I guess maybe that's what it was. I don't know. Maybe it works for women too.
So it's basically saying your value and worth stems from how you do in this area in your life.
Yes. And your so much focus goes on to the sexual side of things when actually in life, the sexual side of things, in marriage at least, is very small percentage.
Yeah, maybe
2%. Yeah. And that's not to downplay that part of marriage, but people go into it with this expectation of it being like
let me tell
huge.
You are not going to spend 24 hours in bed. You have to go to the bathroom sometimes. You got to eat sometimes.
You eventually have to work. Honeymoon goes over. You have to go work. Yeah. And when you have kids, then that even goes down further. I think probably 0.1%.
Maybe next year. You are not touching me again. Go and sleep on it.
So all of these things, we're just creating this sort of, this god of sex.
Yeah.
And so in order to worship at the altar of this god of sex, that's where the purity rings come in. So where you're like, I will do this for my purity. I will do this for my future mate. And instead of, why am I doing this? For God's glory, not for God to give me something, but for God's glory.
Because I want to honor him with my body. Yeah. But that's a verse that is in the Bible where it says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit? So therefore honor God with your body.
Yeah. I was thinking about it, and I was thinking of the if-then comparison. So are you saying, if I do X, then I
will get
whatever Y?
Yeah.
Instead of, if I do X, which is what God wants me to do, then God gets glory, or God is shown through me, or God is the one who is the beneficiary, not me.
This is the mistake of the prosperity gospel too, because they say that as a Christian, everything is supposed to be perfect and wonderful and absolute. Is not. It wasn't that way for the disciples. It certainly wasn't that way for Jesus. So why would we be any different? When they say Christians should be rich, we should never be sick, we should never have any problems. Where I'd like to see where that actually says that in the Bible. I think that what it says here, and by his stripes you will be healed of my sins. Yeah. I really am.
And there is an ultimate healing. There is.
Once we all end up in heaven.
Yeah, once you're in heaven, there is no more death or illness or any negative, any
pain, no tears, no.
Exactly.
No marriage? Oh, wait. Did I say that out loud?
No marriage, giving in marriage? Wow. You're single in heaven? Wow.
That's a problem. Yeah.
How is this purity culture going to survive in heaven?
We don't need it. Throw it out.
Yes. The whole premise of the purity culture is based on shame and fear. Like, those are the things that keep you in between the lines.
Yeah.
If you merge out of them, you're going to have shame or fear. And yet that's not why we're called to live a godly life. That's not why we're called to not sin, because we'll have shame or we'll have fear of other things happening to us. Why we're called to do these things is for God's glory and because God commanded it. So if we're not doing something because of fear and shame, then the reason we might be doing a right thing for the wrong reason. Thank you, attention and honesty.
Yeah. But some of the things that happen is that people become stunted, especially in communicating about sex. Like, how often is sex actually talked about in the church? People tend to shy away from it. They don't. How do you deal with it? You've got these single people. How do you tell them that abstinence, there's a reason why God asks you, and that's, again, is to honor him with our bodies. But people are still having sex, but they're hiding it now.
Yeah.
So they put it where nobody can see me. So then we don't.
And the large part of that is pornography.
Yes. Yeah.
It becomes hidden in plain sight. We're seeing the numbers going down as low as 5 or 6 years old the first time they see pornography.
And that's very sad.
It is. And that becomes normalized.
Somebody had mentioned that pornography addiction has taken out a whole generation of men, the illusion and seduction and pleasure without covenant commitment. Yeah. And the thing that you don't realize is that these kind of things can actually stunt your ability to relate to a real human being, because you've got this expectation in your brain. And although I've had people argue against me, any psychologist will tell you that a pornography addiction will grow if you don't stop it. It may start off with, I'll just look at a picture or two, to watching videos, to it escalates.
Yeah, it gets ever increasingly distorted versions of sex.
Yeah. They equate it to be like a heroin addiction. And the one thing about that is that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. And it is really hard to train your brain once you leave that to not see that anymore.
I know I had this one girl I used to work with years ago. I don't think she was a believer, but she had dated a boy who was a pastor's son. And they had sex outside of marriage, but she said he couldn't have sex unless there was porn playing in the background. And she's going, and this is a pastor's son. And I was told I was not good enough for him.
Yeah. It creates impotency in men. They don't want to hear that word. I'm sorry, but it does. My husband had that very same problem because he had a porn addiction as well. And he could not perform most times. So, and romantic,
Yeah, not even. 'Cause, yeah, and if you even see any interviews with porn stars, they will be the first people to tell you that this is not reality.
No.
Their real lives with their real spouses or boyfriends or girlfriends, it's like nothing, not even a tiny bit, like portray on the porn.
You know what? And a lot of them, sadly, are coerced into this through poverty, through drug addiction, and by watching these and by engaging in pornography, you're actually increasing
increasing the demand for it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people say,
and victimizing more.
yeah, these people they're voluntarily doing it. They're being like complicit. But a lot of times there's a lot of reasons that they're basically coerced into it.
Yeah. They're sex traffickers.
Yeah. But I'd like to say, even if they are, everybody's fine with it. They've all signed letters. They don't need the money. They just want to do it. That's still no reason to say it's acceptable to watch it.
True. Very true.
Because that is not acceptable.
Yeah.
Ways of living. Because like what you said, it does distort. It actually physiologically changes your body, like an addiction, which needs an ever increasing dosage to produce the effects for the things in your body that solves that craving. So you always have to go deeper and darker into the porn.
Yeah.
It starts off, like you said, like with a picture, or you accidentally see something and then you're like, ooh, I'll look at that one thing. But then you see the categories and then you start going, oh, I'm going to try this one. And I'm going to try this. And I guess like the categories get deeper and darker and you get sucked right into it.
It's like a snowball effect.
Yeah. It's just, there's no depth that it won't go to.
Yes. And some of it is really quite depraved.
Yeah.
Yeah. So if
and
you are even...
it actually does change to they've done studies, especially with men. I'm going to say women get in this too, because I have to confess to that too. I had that issue and I deal with it regularly. I'm always tempted by it, but it's something that I have to be aware of. But for men specifically, it actually changes how they treat women.
Yeah.
And they become objects, even they're people that they supposedly love and care about, like mothers or sisters or daughters, and they become nothing more than sex objects, and then they get treated very poorly.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you're ever thinking that might be a way out for you,
that is not the way out.
That is not the way out.
No, find some counseling help for that, because that is definitely something that you don't want to bring, that you should not bring into a marriage.
No, because then you will be...
You think that there's also this idea that marriage solves sexual urges like that?
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
No.
It may for a time, because you're in the exciting honeymoon phase of enjoying each other if you have waited, but then it quickly fades.
Yeah. And usually in the first year, sometimes in the first month, sometimes in the first week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about this purity culture, all of these things, they don't get dealt with. They don't get taught how to properly live their single life. So it gets pushed into the darkness.
Yeah.
When he said it's still being done, but in secret. Or especially this happens a lot for women, is they press down their sexuality so much and are conditioned that they're not to entice men or to even feel sexually in any way, that when it comes to actually on the other side of the marriage vows, they aren't able to perform, or they have an extreme shame reaction because they've been told that this is wrong for so many years. You don't have sex, you don't have sex, you don't have sex. And then all of a sudden, you geared your whole body to this, saying, I can't think this, I can't do this, I can't even look. There's no teaching on how to deal with this in a healthy way. And then they're supposed to flip a switch and suddenly be able to be okay with sex and perform. And it's not fair to anybody.
No. So women especially will have these issues in the first years of marriage because of these expectations. Yeah. Neural pathways are formed through shame during a teenage year. So any type of sexual deviance is shameful. Then they get married and expect them to know and act however they want.
Exactly. Yeah. Again, so we create an unhealthy expectation of what marriage is.
Yeah.
We create unhealthy,
desexualized culture.
You're supposed to, basically, essentially castrate yourself prior to the marriage. Yep. So pretend there's no urges, pretend there's none of these things, just squash it down, push it right down. And then it's supposed to just be healthy and once you get married.
But what they say is that the desexualized culture is obsessed with sex. They call it binary, where you have divorced your body from your soul. That's a whole other thing.
not at its best.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we create these young people, and I was living through that culture where you never were told how to healthfully deal with it.
Now what do I do? There are actually quite a few podcasts out there that talk about the prosperity gospel, that talk about the purity culture. One lady, her name is Caitlin Beatty. She calls it the sexual prosperity gospel, which I thought that's a pretty cool, because that's really what it is, right?
Yeah.
There is this part where God created sex as a good thing, but this culture, this purity culture, has taken that and turned it into something a little bit more. So how do we
Alter that thinking.
alter that thinking so that we understand? I'm pretty sure that most people, if they grew up in that culture, they understand it. And if they're outside of that culture, they're probably going, what are you talking about? And how have we been affected in these little ways? And where do we find that middle ground where we could still keep that purity for God without having those outrageous expectations?
Yeah. And it is difficult. There's not a perfect answer for what to do with your sexuality, particularly when you're a teenager, developing hormones and being interested in the opposite sex. Things there's no perfect answer. I can't come to you and say, this is how you do it, because we've already talked about how there's not one way to do things that's the quote unquote right way, because you get into very dangerous waters when you start prescribing specific ways that aren't found specifically in the Bible. Because that's when we can end up with something like the purity culture that was trying to do a good thing but took it too far. So, to me, this has to come to do with teaching someone to be single.
Ooh.
And this is what our ministry is about, teaching how to be single. And you can't divorce the fact that you have sexual urges, but you also you're not to fall prey to them.
Right.
So you need to develop your character. You need to develop things that are for God. And this is an area that will be difficult. So when we talk about being single, it's not all easy.
Yeah.
Just like married isn't all easy. There's no perfect easy road. There's no prosperity road. And this is something that you have to develop with those around you. Create what we call accountability partners to help it when you're having those times of temptation. I don't think it's a bad thing sometimes too to run it out on the field or something like that. That does get energy out. It's just not you're not promising some sort of amazing future just because you do this.
It's okay. I can't handle my body anymore. We're going for a run.
And a cold shower or whatnot. Sometimes you have to just meet it on physical with physical like that to try to derail it, where you may end up going with it.
And you have to realize that because God made us sexual creatures, you have to own that, right? So if you operate out of shame and fear, something will break. Some disconnect will happen eventually. So do you want to operate out of your freedom in Christ or out of your woundedness and shame?
Right? So I guess part of it is to understand, why are you wanting marriage? Why are you wanting a spouse? Just to fulfill those sexual desires? What if you went to your spouse on your wedding day and it's your vows and you're like, will you vow to me that you will be there sexually at all the points that I want? That's why I want you, for your body. Was that something you're going to include into your vows? I want you for your body only because I have these sexual desires and this is the only way I can get them. Talk about unromantic.
Thanks. Bye.
And so why are you looking at it as an extension of the body of Christ, of being within an institution God has placed, which is a representation of Christ in the church? And you're looking to commit with somebody for the long haul, for the good and the bad, and develop into one another and to give from yourself to the other person. Christ sacrificed himself for the church, and that is the calling of the husband, to sacrifice yourself for your wife. The wife is to love the husband. These should be what you're thinking about. And yeah, sometimes I want to just put this out there. Physical urges are sometimes really hard to throw into the background.
Yep.
It's not going to be just click and it can go away. This takes work. It takes time. It takes practice of being able to self-control. You're supposed to have self-control, that you are in charge of your body.
It's one of the fruits of the Spirit, self-control.
Right? Control. And so this is a good time to practice that.
Yeah.
And so I would find too, and this might be a parent, but sometimes it can work better if it's not somebody so close that you can have a conversation with, that you're maybe like an uncle or an aunt or something, And you can just ask, like, how were they able to deal with it? Or
did they deal with it?
Or,
and then there's grace.
right? And there's also, when it comes to the shame and the fear culture, like, if somebody does fall, if somebody's watching porn, if somebody does sleep with somebody, or they go farther than they should, even if sexual intercourse doesn't happen, that's when you get legalistic. We didn't actually have sexual intercourse, but yet you went everything else. But it doesn't mean all is lost. Grace is there. God is there. Their forgiveness is there. But also a change of heart, a change of attitude, a change of life is also needed.
Yeah. People ask, why is abstinence important anyway? I think part is you've got to understand your sexual nature, where it came from, why it's there, why God gave it to you. One person coined the phrase that sexuality is my right relationship with the Creator. So, and I continued on. So it's not just the right relationship with the Creator, it's passion for Jesus, being in love with the God of the universe, and then everything should fall into its proper place. So you have to have that first. If you understand your sexuality, your sexual nature is from the Creator himself. So if it's from the Creator, that's where it should be held.
Yeah.
And God can hold you to that accountability if you give him that right to your body. But you have to give him that right to your body. But I don't know if I want to. But yes, you do. Because letting yourself, if you continue to fall into the sin of sexual immorality, you will eventually start feeling shame over your own weaknesses. That's where God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made manifest in your weaknesses. There's always God. If you always turn around and say, there's always God. There's always God, and he will not leave you or forsake you.
Exactly. So this is not an easy topic, and we can see how purity culture, it affected so many people, but there was such a good heart behind it, and yet it hurt so many people.
Yeah.
What happens if you don't get married? What happens to that person who's been promised it?
Yeah.
If you do this and this, you get your awesome marriage. Then it never happened. You start praying these things like, name it and claim it. Sounds a little like that.
And sadly, a lot of this purity culture was targeting more for teenagers. So that makes it hard on them too, because they're going through puberty. Their hormones are raging all over the place. Ask any parent who's raised a teenager, how does that feel for you?
And this is where it is important to try to have accountability. And as parents, you need to be aware of what's going around. You can talk to your kids openly about stuff. You can answer almost any question with age-appropriate answers.
Yeah. We're going to wait until the pastor does a sermon on this.
Yeah. Just wait a few weeks. We're almost there.
We're almost there. Yeah.
But there's always people like, oh, I'll tell you that when I get older, or don't worry about it. You won't understand.
Yeah.
Or anything. But there's always age-appropriate answers.
Yeah.
That tell the truth.
Yeah.
So one thing is that's demystifying sex.
Yes. Yes. And that apparently I shouldn't say apparently, because I remember hearing another person who, I can't remember who it was, who mentioned that when you talk to your children about sex and you don't leave it for the schools or you don't leave it for their friends, you demystify it, and then they're not so curious about it anymore, because then they go, oh, okay. And then they go on and do their own thing.
Yeah.
It's not this great thing.
It's not a traumatizing thing either whenever they get it. Yeah. Like my parents, their view is always to answer any questions we had.
Oh, yeah.
Age appropriately, but we ask a question and then usually they tell us and we'd be like, and then we walk off. Because I remember even in Taekwondo, and it's not specifically about sexuality as far as I know, but I have had kids say, my mom and dad won't tell me this. They said I'm too young. And so like kids do get annoyed and frustrated by that. And
then they'll go look for,
yeah. And so that may not have been specifically about sexual things. It might have been about something like maybe might be something that's just not for them to know. But by telling kids that they're not old enough or they won't understand it, that's not the right answer.
No, because
you can say, this is something that is not for you to know because this is somebody else's like secret or whatever. It's not for you to know. Then at least they understand that it's somebody else is not theirs to know. Not, oh, you can't understand it or you're too young. Yeah. Thank you for listening to our podcast on the prosperity gospel and purity culture. We hope that our discussion has sparked some reflection and dialogue around these important topics. We understand that some of the things we talked about may have been uncomfortable or challenging to hear, but we believe that it's important to shed light on these issues and have open and honest conversations about them. We want to let you know that next week we'll be continuing this conversation with part 2 of our episode. We hope that you'll join us as we continue this insightful and thought-provoking discussion. As always, if you have any feedback or questions, we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, take care and live your single life to its fullest.